I'm going to kick this off, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some mainly academic work. For those who love equations, there will be some equations. Hooray! For those who don't, you can mill out at the back in a moment. And like many things in the academic sector, I am merely the messenger. All mistakes are mine, and the wonderful students that I work with are really the people who promote and do so much of the work. And I want to give a few sort of little case examples about why I'm worried about AI and what we can do about it. One of the first things that I worry about is building models that perform really well across data sets. It's difficult to create a model that does very well on a single data set, but even more difficult to make one that stands the test of time. I'm sure Brian, if you've chatted to him, will talk about all our work in Foundry around continual meta-learning, constantly make models keep track with the changing world, because making sure that things persist and work well next week, even though they're working well right now, is actually a really, really difficult challenge. The second part of all this that I'm really worried about is just the sheer scale of training and running models in terms of time, in terms of servers, in terms of electric and other energy costs. So, we are walking towards a kind of AI eco-disaster in many, many ways if we continue in this trajectory. And I'll back that up with a few pretty scary facts and figures in just a moment. And the final thing for anybody who has flown here is the fact that if you go and your plane is actually a pig, you know that there's been some kind of simple spoofing of an AI system. And it is unbelievable that systems across the AI eco-world of sort of the taxonomies of different models will get this right, but with the tiny imperceptible changes to the input, we'll say very confidently that this is now an airline and not a pig. To us, that is ludicrous. So one take-home message is AI does not work the same way we do. What is sensible and common sense to us is absolutely not the case with AI. So let me kick off with a few scary facts. Those who are very perceptive will see I have a picture of an airliner. There's no prizes for guessing where I got that picture from if you look at its wings. Go on Stable Diffusion, give me an airliner. But even right at grassroots, at the academic level, 80% of publications look at performance rather than performance versus the energy costs and the efficiency. So, one of the great uniquenesses of Foundry, and I think that comes very much from the sort of the academic foundations both Mike and I are embedded within, is that models should work seamlessly with small data and big data, but importantly, they try and extract big knowledge. They don't necessarily just require behemoth data sets in order to operate. But really quite frightening. Modern large language model, take your pick, it's around about the equivalent of 500,000, so 500 tons of carbon dioxide. That's about the same as 500 round-trip flights between London and New York. Given that, the next thing we find out is that people who work with all these models think that training is only 10%. The total cost is more like 5,000 round-trip flights between London and New York. So that's a single large language model, and this is only going to get worse. And in fact, if we look at the projected growth of all this energy, this is the pink to do with deployment of AI, this bar for scale is the entire world's nuclear power output. And of course, the world doesn't just do nuclear, it burns things and has renewables as well, but that just is for scale. We are moving into an environment whereby already large language models are consuming more energy than the entirety of the UK. And that really worries me because these models do so much, they solve a small problem, they can write poems and draw pictures about it afterwards. And my question is always, is that really the efficient kind of lean, clean, serviceable, updatable model that we want? And we wouldn't be the only people to worry about this. the sheer costs of AI are really overwhelming even the very biggest companies. So I know, Bill Gates has a kind of mixed press, but he's really pushing micronuclear at the moment and kind of heavily investing in that, not just as an individual technologist, but also in terms of Microsoft. And I'm sure many of you saw the news very recently that they've bought and they're going to reopen 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. So this is one of the things that kind of is on the agenda, the background of motivation for everything I'm going to talk about today. The second critical point is the airliner and the pig. So, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and we can try and make things sort of a little bit of comical, of course, with AI. You can maliciously or not maliciously just graffiti a road sign, and AI systems think it's a refrigerator filled with lots of food and drinks. That's kind of hilarious. Slightly less hilarious, maybe, is we have models with no retraining. These are off-the-shelf large language models which can bring in a mixture of graphical input but also text. What's this person doing in this image? This is pretty innocuous. It looks grainy because there's tiny sort of bits of noise being added, and what we end up with is an absolutely foul string of expletives. So if you don't want your large language models in your chatbots to come out with these kind of things, we need to find some way in which we can understand the threats to the kind of models that we are now beginning to run across our society. And it's not just these big models online. It's a very nice bit of work which involved, you may not even be able to see, there's a couple of little bits of white putty physically put on a road, and the Tesla lane assist thinks that that is a lane. So you can just put bits of putty on the road, and partly self-driving cars, semi-autonomous vehicles absolutely get the topography of the landscape completely wrong. And these kind of attacks are relatively straightforward and extremely difficult to prohibit. So that's the next thing that I'm really worried about, is sort of that safety critical as well as energy. So our kind of goal up front is about being able to give things like an energy rating, like your fridge, A, B, C, whatever it is, for every model and every deployment, but also a safety rating as well. So a bit like when you go and buy a car, you wouldn't buy a car that is incredibly inefficient energy-wise and has the lowest safety rating. Yet in many instances, people are just using AI models that combine the worst of both worlds. And the question is why? Because they don't necessarily know. And I think that that is part of the agenda that we certainly have. To me, this is all about generalization, and generalization is really about how to tame complexity, and it's that famous thing, Occam's razor, solutions should be complex enough to give explanations, but no more complex than that. So if you need to do something with tabular data, you don't need something that writes poems about it afterwards. And doubly for me, I got, again, AI to produce. I said, give me a calling card, Steve Roberts, Bayesian, with a normal distribution. Those who work with normal distributions will know that actually isn't a normal distribution. It's too heavy in the tails, which even I am. And so, AI doesn't even get that right. However, we live in a world where AI got this right, and it must have been a deep model, deep learning rules. And that really annoys me because, I'm an out-and-out probabilistic machine learning guy, and it's always irked me that deep learning works so darned well and just outperforms pretty much everything. And it's bothered me. And I'm going to, in this talk, give a little exploration as to why actually deep learning models are actually hidden Bayesians. They do the right thing. They belong to the religion of Bayes. And inside them, they're just good Bayesian models desperate to get out in their black boxes. So here is the kind of first old school. This is from the early 1990s, the great Chris Bishop book, figures like this, and figures like this from the late, great David Mackay, who sadly passed away some time ago, who wrote this under the tutelage. His supervisor was John Hopfield, who of course has just got the Nobel Prize this year. So well done, John. I like to think had David lived, he would have been certainly up there with the Nobel laureates. And this sort of Bayesian model is all about finding solutions which are not so compact that they're really good at certain data sets, not so broad that they're really average at a great many data sets, but for a particular data set, finding a model which outperforms the narrow and myopic and outperforms the very broad jack of all trades. And this is really at the heart of things like Bayesian learning. And you can tell this is really important because people forgot about it for a very long time. And around about 30 years later, this is in 2022, this picture came out. You can tell 30 years have passed because this is in colour, not black and white, and is ostensibly the same thing. So this is still very pertinent. And one thing I'd love to get across is old school stuff still works, and it's really vital even in the hype of the 2020s in AI. And I want to talk a little bit about one area of generalization, which is called regularization, and you maybe come across this if you do any kind of AI and machine learning. I think of regularization as just how bendy or how stiff is a piece of metal that you're trying to fit in between some nails. And I've been a bit cheeky and I've put little springs on the nails, and each of these springs has got a little spring constant. So if I don't touch the nail, I stretch the spring. I've got to bend my bit of wire, and that's got a bending energy or stiffness given by alpha. This is a classic physics problem. Go fit my problem, given a stiffness of wire, very flexible wire, and we don't have to stretch our springs, really stiff wire, and it's very smooth, but we stretch the springs. And this is an absolute exact mathematical analogy for what many learning systems are doing, which is they're trying to minimize distances away from data points while at the same time minimizing how bendy the function has got to be. Bendiness is a really good proxy for complexity, and we started out by saying we're going to try and solve this by taming complexity. So this is the kind of thought experiment. Again, old school, this all goes back to, these are referred to as Tikhonov regularizers, and this goes back to a really lovely bit of work in the 1970s by Tikhonov and Arsenin, who first were talking about the mathematics of these kind of optimization approaches. Is bendiness the only way? Well, no. It turns out what you can also do is you can kind of inject noise at different levels in a model. And this was a bit of work that my students Alex and Matthew were doing a little while back. And the further in the model at different places, the more smooth you end up making the solutions. So one little take-home is you can force models to be more general by making solutions smoother, making them less complex, but you can also do it by adding kind of noise of the world. Big deep nets often will do that by people doing augmentation of data sets. Take lots of images and they add a bit of noise and they fiddle with them in random ways. And this helps to promote a much smoother representation space. And we're just going to need this thought concept as we go through in just a moment. And most importantly, there are many, many other ways, but they all basically work the same way. The history of AI is people rediscovering the same darn thing, but calling it a different name. It takes 20 years for you to go, isn't that the same? So, which is, I think, what is happening. So it's probably a good time for AI and its fusion of all these techniques. Those who work in this area will probably have heard of things like early stopping, momentum, stochastic weight averaging, Bayesian model averaging, and the list goes on. But ultimately, I think this picture comes from Keskar et al. Some 7 or so years ago now. And it's this sort of idea that if we think about what's going on in a world that slightly changes, if I learn something about what's out there in front of me right now, and I come back in 20 minutes and there's been small changes, we can represent those small changes as perturbations. And if my solution of my model is not resistant to those small perturbations, then all is lost. So what we really want to promote are sort of solutions that sit at the bottom of what we would call a flat, smooth bowl. And that means that when the next time I come to solve something with a little bit of a jittered world around me, I still end up with a pretty darn good solution. Contrast that if I've got a very sharp, super sharp, over-fitted solution. Next time the world meets me, it's a bit perturbed, and you can see that perturbation takes me to a region where I'm doing really, really badly indeed. So I'm now very brittle to perturbations, be they adversarial or just due to the noise of the world or the dynamics of change. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a very quick intro into the dynamics of how these massive neural networks work. This works across all major classes, be they transformer models, be they res nets, be they convolutional nets, vision transformers or whatever. And we're going to kind of start out by taking this little picture, and I'm just going to define something. Here's a bit of mathematics, which you don't really need to know, but it's so lovely I can't resist talking about it. This guy here is called the Hessian matrix, and it really is if I'm stood at the bottom of a sort of a depression in the earth, which is kind of like my lectures at 9 o'clock in the morning. But I'm kind of stood in this, and I'm looking. It's to do with the steepness in all the major directions of travel, to do with how sharp that bowl is around me, and it might be quite shallow or very steep. And this really is defined by these things called eigenvalues. Again, doesn't really matter what they are, we can compute them. And we can compute how sharp the solutions are. So we already know smoother, less sharp is probably better. And for massive, massive models, there's so many of these, 10 trillion parameters, there's 10 trillion of these, and they form a distribution, and that's got a fancy name. It comes from random matrix theory, again, a couple of Russians, Marchenko and Pasteur, and it forms a distribution that looks a little bit like that. Okay, so that's great. What do real neural nets look like? So if we actually do that with a canonical convolutional neural network, a 16-layer. The VGG, Visual Geometry Group here in Oxford, have a lot of pre-trained checkpoints in these. You download them and you run it on a classic problem, an image problem, a CFAR 100K problem. You run it a bit and you find, this looks like the Marchenko-Pasteur. Think of this as the kind of dull, wobbly distribution of kind of run-of-the-mill parameters that are not too sharp yet not too flat. And we get these cheeky outliers. And what we know is that when we do training in very deep models, it's these outliers that form the solutions. Because you can go in and you can go, okay, you out here, right out there, what are you doing there? It's kind of, well, I'm representing this part of the solution boundary. Oh, what are you doing? Well, I'm representing this bit of the solution boundary. So it's really this small number of outliers that get formed by random initialization, which kind of end up nucleating or crystallizing bits of our solution. And that's really interesting. What does that look like kind of in the dynamics? There's a really important concept in optimization theory, which is called the edge of stability, which is very much like me on a Friday after teaching most of the week. But below the edge of stability, we get convergence. So these are simple optimization. Parameters wobble, but they converge to a distinct solution. Above the edge of stability, you start them in the same place, and they just get bigger, and they do crazy things. So classical orthodoxy is that you always have models below the edge of this edge of stability. So if you do that, you start getting what we would call progressive sharpening or gradient flow in these very big models. And we sort of get slight improvements again and again and again in the training error. But we don't get nearly the performance that we would really like. So what we have to worry about then is how these very deep models then do some pretty funky things. And what they end up doing is moving into this second phase. These outlying eigenvalues, these big values in that distribution, kind of get bigger and bigger. They go above the edge of stability, and they induce instabilities in the model. And the parameters wobble and wobble and wobble, and we can look at that. Here's the edge of stability. We flow nicely up to it. We go wobble, wobble, wobble. We drop down. We go wobble, wobble, and the other eigenvalues are doing it. And this is the typical learning outcome from the dynamics of learning in a typical deep network. Whatever that is, be it a transformer, skip-connected ResNet, or convolutional neural network. And this is kind of nice, because if we project all these, we can see these parameter oscillations. We kind of start out, and we end up with these big steps. We end up with a bit of oscillation. We exit this oscillation. So it's a bit like we're kind of building up and then shooting out at some point. And we end up then going into another and another and another and another. So these oscillations, you naively would think we need to get rid of them because we should have this nice convergent system. Not so. These play a really, really vital part for generalization. And the insight really was that these induce these kind of big wobbles associated with these so-called Hessian matrices. But importantly, when we go through one of these big induced unstable wobbles, we come out of it always flatter than when we went in. So what's happening here is that we are debiasing the model from doing even more fine-tuning in directions that are always super sharp and super crisp, that are going to lead to safety and security issues downstream and poor out-of-sample generalization. And we begin to up-bias directions which are maybe a little bit smoother, but which still solve the problem really, really well. And this is a fantastic thing to realize, because what this means is these deep models do really, really well, but they do very well as long as they're allowed to go unstable. And those instabilities are like injecting noise, but specifically in directions where the solution is going to be very fragile. So, deep neural networks at their very heart, and remember, noise, regularizing, they're Bayesian. They're trying to do the right thing. They're regularizing against overfitting in certain directions by injecting noise preferentially into these directions. And the moment we realize that, it kind of is like opens the world up to being able to work with these in a much more profound way. And what we showed is that we can get much better out of sample, so test accuracy, train on a data set, and then see how well it does on a new data set. How good is it out of sample? If you go below the unstable regime, you don't really get much for your money. That's this little purple regime here below these dotted lines. The moment you have a learning rate that promotes instability and self-regularization, you end up massively improving. This is this VGG on a 5K image data set. You end up with this massive improvement in out-of-sample performance. And that, in real terms, is about a 20% improvement. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. So, that really excited us. But we're going to go old school one more time. And I really like the old school stuff. For those who know NeurIPS used to be called NIPS. NeurIPS is the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference. And back in 1991, which, I had the pleasure of being there, when there were only about 150 people and you knew everybody and everybody went skiing and then you gave your talk in ski boots at the end of the day. Gone are those days for anybody who's been to NeurIPS recently. John Moody was introducing this generalized prediction error and a bit more maths, but bear with me. Right the way back in 1970, the great Japanese mathematician Akeki wrote down this equation and proved that it was correct. And it said, if I have some training error, how well my model's done on the data set it trains on, and it's got a certain number of parameters, and there's certain training errors, then I can work out bounds on the test error on any new data set. And that's really profound. John Moody updated it kind of for the modern world, noting that not every parameter pulls its weight in one of these massive 7 billion parameter models nowadays, and introduced this idea of an effective number of parameters. And that's got a funky equation, but it's really about how many real degrees of freedom, because many of these parameters are just wobbling around, acting a bit like a heat bath. They're not really doing anything. They're not helping the problem. So the number of real degrees of freedom is potentially a billionfold less than the number of parameters we're trying to train. And that's good news if you want to form leaner, cleaner models. We started looking at that, and we found that it correlated really, really well with out-of-sample performance. So worrying a little bit about these effective degrees of freedom is very, very important. Now, for those who love mathematics, and I'm doing there will be some in the audience, we can turn this insight into an algorithm, and you look and go, oh, we already knew kind of about that. It's called diagonal preconditioning matrices, and it's a kind of classic in numerical analysis. But you get this coming out of all of this. So you kind of go, okay, maybe there's a bit of legs in it. We can actually produce some algorithms that do this. And when you do, you kind of go, okay, do I get better performance? And across the board, we're yet to find an approach with data where we can't outperform existing state-of-the-art using conventional learning. And this works across natural language processing, it works across vision tasks, it works across a whole range of numerical tasks as well. But that's great if all you're interested in is performance. But there's a couple of other things that we needed to worry about as well. Smaller, lower cost models. And I think that knowing that most of the parameters in a model are redundant, they're just used to produce this sort of a heat bath of randomness during training, gives us the insight to know that we can produce much, much more compact models. That could be great, but it also could be a little bit of a worry. So here is a little bit of work that's been done by some folks in MIT. And here, what they're doing is they're looking at the accuracy of big neural networks as you begin to prune away loads and loads of the parameters. So by down here, there's only 1% of your original model left because you've removed all the rest. Up here, you can see performance is pretty well unchanged right the way maybe in some of their models through to where we're doing around about, say, 10%. So that means in a big model, I've got a slightly less big model. So around about 1/10 of the parameters. That was called lottery ticket. This has been taken even further using some of the ideas that come from random matrix theory and these effective degrees of freedom. And what they've shown is that you can get really good performance even when you're looking at around about 0.1% of one of these very big models. You don't need to be deploying it and using all the nuclear power on the planet and all the energy of a nation. You can be running these lean and clean, but nobody is really doing that at the moment. So, where have we seen this before? Well, I don't know whether if Alessandra's here. Hey, Alessandra. Alessandra Tosi led a really lovely bit of work on the Gaia Green AI Auditor. And what she, Dav, and various people in the company were doing were looking at ways you could build in the energy costs of running a model and deploying it on a candidate data set as part of the learning. And this would disadvantage models which took a long time, had big CPU, GPU costs, and a very big memory footprint. It was a fabulous bit of work, but it maybe wasn't right at its time. I truly believe now, I sit on the National Engineering Policy Council, and we're debating this right now. How does the UK move to a low energy AI environment? Given that North America has, basically taken the ticket for all the high energy models, we can focus on the kind of low energy ones. So I think this kind of technology really needs to be resurrected and brought to the fore. Safer models. Well, what we know is that models that do well on similar but slightly different data are also more resilient to the pig into an airliner kind of attacks. Models that are not so fragile that you can find white or black box ways to spoof them are likely to be models which generalize better. And we can show that sort of in a formal sense to do with something called reachability theory in computer science. And there's a bunch of people kind of out there doing that. I gave a talk in the summer, and David, Robert wasn't there, but one of his students, David, was. We got talking about this and our work when I gave bits of this talk, and they've recently shown that using this in order to select models ends up selecting models that are smaller but actually are more resilient. They have a less high success rate to adversarial cyber attacks. So this is moving all in the right direction. And I'm really excited by that. Why am I excited? Because we got some money. Not the only thing, but in the university. But, it's great to have partners involved. Wonderful people that I get to work with. Sadie Crease, who is former employee and cyber expert from our friends in the West Country, around Gloucester area, Michael Goldsmith likewise, and me, the odd one out. And what we're trying to do is trying to worry about understanding the taxonomy of AI models, working in the real world, and how resilient or not they are to certain cyber attacks. And it is a little bit of a kind of swings and roundabouts. But if you know your application and you know what you need, safety-wise for your application, then downstream we are building tools that will help you solve all that. So this is very, very exciting. And of course, very nicely, this is with the Oxford Martin School, but also with Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre and various other initiatives which are going on in the university right now in conjunction with folks in the West Country and beyond. Very strong links we got to the AI Safety Institute and, of course, a little bit of a seg coming because we also sit within the Oxford Martin School, which is where my friend Mike has his programme on AI governance. So here we're looking at safety. So our goal over the next 18 months, 2 years, is to really do the following. Why is it that AI models don't get analysed when you say what data you're looking at in your deployment, and they don't give you 2 stickers to put on the model? Firstly is an energy rating, like a white good appliance, like a refrigerator. You want to choose low energy models if that is one of your goals. Secondly, you need to have something like a car safety rating, because you would not go out and deploy a model that's got poor protection if you are going to have that public facing. Otherwise, you're going to get strings of expletives and dodgy outputs from every perturbation attack. So, our goal is to produce these safety and efficiency ratings. I think this allows AI consumers, clients, and people who want to use AI extra information. When we buy a fridge or you buy a car, you go and you look at the efficiency of the car and you look at its safety rating as part of your buying decision. Likewise, you would want to do the same with AI before deploying it. And what we want to do, we're sort of looking across the whole insurance sector to worry about where safety resilience can be considered, to be able to provide clients and insurers a way of producing energy and safety ratings to help do AI insurance. So I will say thank you all so very much.